Hey everyone, Alyag here, and today's plan of operations is to prepare and film a live performance video to accompany the release of my upcoming single, Vampyro Toothus. So every time I record a performance video for any one of my tracks, I usually have to prepare a separate session for it. And typically what I'll do is, as I've done in this case, is I'll bounce out all the stems for a lot of the major buses and things like that. I'll usually take off the sidechain compressor before I bounce out the stems so that I can just basically reactivate it again in the session. So there's usually a separate sidechain track, which is typically muted. It's just a very sharp transient, very annoying clav type sound that's typically synced to the kicks and snares. And usually how I route this stuff is I'll have the drum track on its own, and then everything else will usually be in its own bus, and that's the one that I would apply the compressor onto. So what we'll do here, 2, 4, and then it's getting its feet from the trigger track. And the attack time I usually set as quickly as I possibly can, and then for the release time what I'll usually do is I'll using that classic old timing formula, 60,000 divided by the tempo of the track, in this case 160, or I guess 80 if you wanted half time it or whatever, but in this case we're doing 160, which ultimately, if you do it, it's 60,000 divided by 160 divided by 4, that'll give you some division. I think it's either an eighth or a quarter note or something like that. Don't ask me to do math, but ultimately we end up with 23.4. That way, the compressor releases right in time with the tempo, and it's all groovy. And then usually, let's give it a quick listen here. That'll do. So all this stuff we can leave as is, but the big thing that I want to focus on in this track, because there's actually very few guitar parts in there. Yeah, the only time the guitar parts really have a prominent spot is just during the drops, during the really heavy parts. So already that's going to be a part that I can play along with the guitar live. However, that's only one section, and then the thing I was thinking of doing is so the idea was to play the guitars during the drop, that initial growly bit, and then in this part I've actually exported the stems with this in mind. So this horn bit here, I was thinking of just launching that sample using the launch pad, as well as the growl. So that could be another sample that I can just cut out, assign to a drum rack, and then basically jump between the two, while at the same time, using the argon, play along to that fuzz lead. So I've created a pretty gnarly fuzzy patch on the argon that sounds like it actually could fit in with all this stuff quite well, with maybe a little bit of clever EQing, and then whatever, I can definitely make it blend. And so that was kind of the idea, is play the guitar parts during the drop, and then switch off between the launch pad and the argon for that bit, and then later in the little acid ARP thing I could also assign to another sample, and that way I have something that I can do during the verse. I could also potentially play that little, because I do have a patch on the argon that also coincides with that, and so I could either layer the two and have the live synth being played over the recorded bit, or even just cut this out completely and just play that lead solely on the argon. And then that could also be the next part that I play with the synth. But regardless, before I start chopping all this stuff up, I need to figure out exactly which parts of the track I'm even going to be playing, because typically these can be anywhere from like 4.5 to 8 minutes long. And I guess my philosophy is when I'm creating one of these videos, because you can only ask for so much of someone's attention on the internet as they're scrolling through or whatever, so you don't want to put them through a whole 7-minute ordeal with some really long intro or some drawn out thing. Like, chances are they're probably just going to lose interest after a little while, and if they're really that interested, then they'll probably follow through with your stuff. I usually think it's better just to keep things short and sweet, and then it kind of gives people incentive to actually go and try to check out the full version of your tracks if they're actually interested in following through. So for this, I was thinking of just actually skipping the whole first section of the track, although the way that it fades in, that could work to our benefit here. Just cut all that out. This already sounds pretty seamless, which makes sense because they're the same parts. Maybe just for my own sanity here, I'll add some visual locators just so I know where the hell I am. Sometimes it can't help, in case you have a brain fart or something while you're playing and you're like, oh, where am I? I think my favorite part of this entire track is this whole bendy last drop. Bendy derp. It's fun. So that one I'm thinking I'll do the guitar part there, then re-trigger the horn bit with the launch pad, and then the rest of the time, because I do have the bend range on the argon, I can actually mirror what's going on with. And then at the very end bit, just do the guitars. So the next step is to set up all the input channels. So I guess we'll start probably with the MIDI channel, which will be controlled by the old launch pad there. So on that guy, we'll assign a drum rack, which will shortly start cutting up the samples and dropping them in there. And then I will need 2 audio tracks. So it's a guitar input, and then that'll be for the argon. I guess the other thing that you have to be kind of conscious of is, in a live scenario, is I found that, at least in my setup and interface, 128 samples is generally a low enough buffer where my system doesn't start to choke up. It still allows me to monitor without any latency, at least any noticeable latency. So now that the input channels are all set up, I guess I can go in here and start lopping up these samples here. All right, so I've got the 4 samples assigned here to the launch pad. Nice and easy. And then that'll make it simple for when I actually have to play the parts on the synth while simultaneously launching the samples. It keeps me busy. I guess the one other thing I'll add, thing to keep in mind, is if you're assigning samples to be launched by a drum rack, such as I am, there are a couple settings here that you can tinker with. So first of all, there's the 2 basic settings. There's trigger and gate, which basically control how the clip is launched. So trigger, as soon as you hit that button, it just launches the sample and it plays all the way through, and you can just forget about it at that point. Or if you set it to gate, it'll play as long as you're holding down the button. But in this instance, I'm going to leave these guys on trigger mode, and then the one that I will gate is that growl. For whatever reason, I just want to hold that one down. And the other thing to keep in mind is by default, Ableton will default to these settings, so this just controls sort of volume sensitivity. But in this case, I want the samples to play at full volume, regardless of how hard I hit the pad. And then as well, I want to set that back at 0, so they're playing at the original volume as well. Alright, so with the input channels now set up and the session all mapped out and labeled and edited down, what I can now do is start adding in various automations, such as mutes on the input channels when they're not being played, just to clean things up in case I accidentally bump the strings on the guitar or something like that. So I would basically just go in and just mute it in sections like the verse. I'm also not playing it in the drop or the post drop here. If I wanted to get really specific about it, I could even, if I end up playing these parts, or so that's still up in the air. It depends on how this all flows once I start actually practicing performing the parts, because not only do I have to switch between the 3 instruments, but I also have to change patches on the argon between the melodic sort of plucky sounds and the growly patch. But the way that it might actually end up playing out is I might actually just play this entire final drop strictly on the argon and then triggering the occasional on the launch pad in between or whatever, but also just put in like a high pass filter just to make sure the bass of the synth isn't actually interfering with the rest of the track or whatever. I mean, I'll probably, once the video is recorded, I'll go in and actually specifically mix the stuff in a little bit better before I export it out and sync it with the video. But yeah, and the other thing I may do, depending how this plays out, I'll probably do this after I actually record the video itself, but I'll probably just EQ out quite a bit of the low end and just add the textural higher frequencies in order to make it blend with this sort of this Nero sounding thing, because the argon on itself sounds like this. Now that patch takes up quite a bit of the frequency spectrum, so I'll have to get the two to play nicely together, but that's just a matter of mixing it after the fact, I guess. But other than that, from this point on, all I really have to do is just practice my ass off, jumping between the parts, then set up the stands and everything else away from the computer so I'm not just sitting in front of my desk as I'm playing it, because that looks kind of lame. Probably do a few takes of me screwing it up, but sure, by the end of the day I'll have a finished video and then I can edit it and piece it together and put it out there. Here's hoping it turns out.